10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Good luck, studio.
491. 491.
Darling, it's the Shy Life podcast.
Good, but it's a positive thing, Paul. The highlight, the Shy Life.
You won't find a cast of characters like this everywhere.
Hello, Paul.
I'll go anywhere for a potato.
Delicious.
This particular episode of The Shy Life is a little more abstract than usual. Okay, looks like the hairy guy is ready to record. 3, 2, 1.
Go Shy Yeti.
Oh, I hope he hasn't found out my secret. Do you think he has?
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Shy Life podcast with me, Paul the Shy Yeti. How are you doing? I'm not too bad. I've got Nick here again.
Hello.
How are you, Nick?
You just can't get rid of me, can you?
Yes, listeners, we've recorded bits for 3 episodes. Well, anyway, you don't need to know that. We've just been very busy recording, as usual. That's good. So this episode is a sequel to one we did earlier in the year, all about sort of firsts and lasts, and we'll start off with those ideas and we'll see where it takes us. But I guess I better run the theme music first.
It's time for my old buddy, old pal from across the channel, across the pond, Paul Chandler, the Shy Yeti.
He's not that shy. Oh, it's the Shy Life podcast. Yeah.
All I wanted was a pie, and then I hatched out of an egg. Okay, bring the mic over. He's ready to record.
It's the quiet ones you've got to watch, you know.
Is it metaphorical? Is it deep? Is it deep?
Good boy. He's not all that shy, is right.
Blimey, Governor, it's the Shy Life podcast.
If you thought that was bad, just listen to this.
Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait for it to begin.
It's the Shy Life podcast.
He's positively glowing.
It's all gooey and meaty and yum, 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 yum.
Okay, we're back. Right. So, I have got a list here of some. I think, although I say it's first and last, I think often, firsts are probably better than last because, to a certain extent, we don't know the lasts of some of these things.
Absolutely, yes. And sometimes, if you know, actually, what could be worse than knowing the last of something, unless it's something you don't like doing? Yeah. It's quite depressing having a last, because it's you kind of.
Although to be fair, I think last time we did. Our last time wasn't our last time, but the last time,
yeah,
we did talk about like the most recent time we went to a nightclub, the last to date, etc., etc. But
my last time at the nightclub, as I recall, was pretty humiliating.
Yeah.
The fact. I mean, one has to remember the fact I did actually pitch up drunk anyway. So and.
I was over 40 then, so I kind of
went and nodded off.
Well, I thought we'd start with some musical firsts.
Yeah.
You may not have any answers for these, and it may not be technically the first time you heard these people, but the first time, the memory that sticks with you. So let me see. I've got a list here. Do you remember the first time you heard ABBA?
I knew you were going to say ABBA. Now, 99.9% certain I heard Waterloo in 1974. I don't remember, because I remember that tune always reminds me of being sort of 5 and Jen taping stuff off Top of the Pops and that general kind of era. I think probably my most particular memory of ABBA is earliest one. It's not my earliest, but it's one I particularly, because their music I remember very much of that time. But what I do remember is Dancing Queen coming out just before I started junior, well, round about almost spot on when I started junior school, and being interested in the title and probably not realizing quite literally that, my literal mind thinking a dancing queen. So I drew a picture of the queen dancing and kicking off her shoes and all her sort of courtiers looking somewhat alarmed. And she's having a right old time of it. And I didn't realize queen in the sense of, sort of young girl who is, really good at dancing. So, so that was definitely that. But ABBA music, I think of Mamma Mia, I think of early 1976. I think of SOS, I think of 75. It's very evocative. And also, I Summer Night City, I remember, was in the charts, and Jen was taping it off when we first went to Kent Road. So, but not really anything beyond that, of course. But ABBA were always there. They were in Look-In. They were in on the telly. So their presence was always felt. They were sort of really the reliable stalwarts of pop. But I don't think I've got any. I don't think I can actually remember the first time.
That's still the kind of thing I was looking for. Yeah. I'd say I don't know some of. I mean, I'm sure I would have heard songs, and I remember in about 1980 that Terry Wogan used to play the song called "The Piper," which was on the Super Trooper album. He wasn't a single, but he obviously liked it and played it. But I'm not so good. But then that thing happening is sort of after or around the same time as what I'm going to say is my first time. I don't know if my parents had maybe bought me the first greatest hits by then, but when we were in Athens or Rhodes, I can't remember which one. We went to both, but I can't remember which one was where the record shop was. Possibly Rhodes, I don't know. But anyway, we went. They were obviously, it was coming to the end of the holiday, and they were looking for something. And I get the feeling they must have been trying to get me into ABBA, or thought, oh well, we kind of like ABBA, but I think the intention of my parents was to find music which they wouldn't hate me to be playing. And maybe I'd shown interest to what I'd heard, but I can't remember what I'd heard prior to this. But anyway, we went to this record shop, and it was sort of suggested to me like that here's their most recent album, which in summer 1980 would probably still have been Voulez-Vous. Super Trooper came out around that time as well. But anyway, this was the album that was sold to me, and they put the record on the record shop person. I'm not sure, considering we were in a foreign country, I don't quite know how easy the communication was with my parents. And I was
sounds like he did a pretty good job.
Yeah, and I was sort of 6, and anyway, I remember they put the album on, and the first track on Voulez-Vous is a song called "As Good as New," which is a great song, but again, not a single, but it's a really catchy one, and I was sold.
I used to have a very. It doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But David Sprague and I in the Good as You must have been out before 80, because I have a recording of David Sprague's, which must have been 79 because he left Salisbury in 79, singing the first few bits of As Good as New.
Well,
As Good as New, I love you.
Yeah, because the album Voulez-Vous would have been out in 79. Then I think Volume 2, ABBA Greatest Hits Volume 2 came out, and then Super Trooper. But so I was a little bit behind by the time it was sold to me. But
I kind of went back to ABBA in the late 80s because the two Greatest Hits 1, Greatest Hits 2 were on tape in at work at my shop, and I remember buying those two together. I've obviously got the CDs now. So But
obviously, I went through. I've been buying them again on vinyl, but I was listening to the album which has Waterloo on just only today. But I want to move on to another group.
can I just say, last memory, ABBA, dead easy. A couple of days ago, there's at least 2 ABBA songs on my MP3 player at the moment. So, I've got SOS, and maybe it's just SOS. So I've currently got SOS on my listening tunes.
Yeah. I suppose listening to this album on my record player today is my last to date.
Let's hope it's not last.
I've got to edit this. So another favourite of mine, and you can do this band and another band I know you like more. What are your first memory of the Beatles, and what's your first memory of Wings?
Ooh. Right. Beatles. I don't know. I mean, I grew up when I was growing up. The Beatles were always there. I don't think I think it was probably the 1980s when I went to Highbury, where the Beatles were actually. They were only just over 10 years away. So we were learning about the Beatles and what style they were in our first music lessons. So I went. So I can't honestly say when I first heard of the Beatles, because I was again, they were always there. But I do have a significant memory that almost precisely 40 years ago, when I went to Highbury, that's the secondary school I went to, first music lesson was a tape recording of Yesterday. So whenever I hear Yesterday, I always think of my first day at Highbury in 1980. And Miss Morley played Yesterday, and we studied it. We studied what sort of a kind of, it came, certain bits came from rhythm and blues, and of course, I think probably my sister would be able to answer I think my brother-in-law already has answered the Beatles question, but yes, that was a significant thing. The fact that the Beatles were already as early as 1980 taught in schools in a historical context, even though they'd only split up for 10 years. And at that stage, just about at that stage, they were all still alive. Lennon was shot 4 months later. Last memory of Beatles, probably a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about them with my sister and brother-in-law. I'm guessing. For my own part, I've probably said this on record before, but for me, all of the Beatles were much more interesting on their own. I felt once they had sort of separated out their various talents, I just find them more. I find Lennon more interesting on his own. I find McCartney, with Wings and on his own, I find superb. And which brings us neatly onto Wings.
I was going to say, I think I was saying that McCartney and Lennon got to do pretty much what they wanted to do in the Beatles. So you are hearing authentically what those. I mean, a lot of the Beatles songs are effectively solo songs, but they just think the other person or the other person would just jump in. What I would say, which does definitely agree with you, is that someone like George Harrison was always. And maybe by the end of the Beatles, he was getting a bit more say, but he was being given like, oh yeah, you can do 1 song or 2 songs for this album. He didn't get to sort of spread his wings so much until his solo career. So that's definitely right. But yeah, the wing.
Maybe the developing styles of each Beatle as they mature, as they went in different directions to what they want to do. Maybe that just appealed to me. The direction they took appealed to me perhaps a bit more. I'm not dissing the Beatles by any means.
No, but to be fair, I think it's one of those things that to a casual listener, it's difficult to know unless you actually start reading books about the Beatles. It's not always obvious. A song like Yesterday is definitely more a Paul McCartney type song.
Yeah.
There are songs that are definitely more, but it's it's a whole, like as you say, there are books and books about who wrote what, and in the same way as with Doctor Who did this, and it's quite difficult to pick it all apart. But what about Wings? What about Wings?
Yeah, Wings. I can button down a little bit more. I can't believe I didn't. I mean, I went to see it. Yeah, well, actually, yes. Thinking about it, Live and Let Die. I went. I was taken to see Live and Let. I cannot. I've got my mum's diaries from 1973 and 74, and we went to the cinema loads in the 70s. But I cannot find. I could have sworn somewhere along the line, and this is the only little Let's diaries, but I could have sworn somewhere along the lines I've got when I saw Live and Let Die, because it was the first Bond film I ever saw. Considering I was only 5 at the time, 4 or 5 at the time, it's actually quite a scary film to actually take a kid to, not to mention a bit risque. But I remember it very well, and so that must have been my first Wings experience with the Live and Let Die song. Which I think is terrific, but I think beyond that, 2 very distinctive Wingsy memories. I remember from this every time I hear Silly Songs and Let 'Em In, I'm immediately taken back to the summer of '76, because those are 2 beautifully, kind of feel good, summery songs, which I remember very well at that time, and it reminds me of sort of kicking around with Jen and kicking around with David Buxton, and who was my best friend at the time, and the very, very hot summer, of course. And that brings back, and also finally, with Little Luck, in 1978, again listening to records in my dad's study downstairs at the Beaches, and that was definitely one he used to play a lot. And I always associate Little Luck with James and the Giant Peach, because we were reading that at school. And I think I bought the book as well. And of course, the intricate pictures I was flipping through it. I used to flip through it whilst we were listening to this. So I always think of James and the Giant Peach with a Little Luck. And the fact that it was the first time I noticed Asylum Records, and there's this little Asylum. What's that? And there's where they stick loonies, I think, which is what they used to say, how it was described to me. Yeah. But yes, last Wings memory. Ooh. Have I got any Wings on there? Well, probably. Actually, yes. On Keith's show, Box of Delights on Wednesday nights, I think I actually requested Let 'Em In. So yes, that would have been my last. Hopefully not my last. I don't currently have a CD of Wings, but I would definitely be interested. We used to have one, but it broke, or it's sort of scratched or something. There
used to be a greatest hits that was probably out in the late 70s or around in the 80s. It was pretty much the only one of Wings as far as being a greatest hits. Yeah. And I used to have it on tape. I think my dad bought that, and I sort of ended up nicking it, basically. And of course, over the years, there's been so many. There's been the sort of. Often when they release a greatest hits, it'll be because the CD allows for more space than tape or vinyl did. So, but I like that say 12 songs or whatever that was on that old greatest hits. I do have a vinyl copy of it, but you can't actually buy that version, I don't think, anymore, because there are so many new versions of either Wings and Paul McCartney greatest hits, or just Wings. Even on its own, they're more expanded. They're more expanded these days.
Oh, right, that's interesting, because I've currently on my Amazon wish list. I've got a Wings best of. So which I think might be a late 70s one. I think you might be right about that. I think it's probably from there.
I think personally I got into the Beatles because it was suggested by my parents that I should. But I definitely liked them, and also got to the point where having a greatest hits wasn't enough, and I had to get albums, etc., etc. And then I think Wings sort of became, when I ran out of Beatles albums, I then sort of expanded into solo stuff and
I have to say, Muller Kintyre. I forgot to mention Muller Kintyre. That reminds me very much of the Christmas '77, and because it was number one, and working on the Magnet editor and a house party we had, and Blake Seven starting. So I have very happy memories of Muller Kintyre.
Funnily enough, it's not a last memory, but it's a memory I have. I mean, I was very much interested in the '60s. Doctor Who, The Avengers, all the shows that were being, even like the '50s with Hancock and stuff. So I was always a child who was interested in the past more than I was far more interested in the '60s and the '80s than I was in the '80s. In the '80s,
yeah, in the '80s.
But I do remember being at school probably in the very late '80s, and when we still had, I think it was probably my first year, so perhaps it was about '87 or '88. When we still did music before we had to choose our GCSEs, and I think I ended up probably dropping music because I wasn't musical enough to subject to do. But I know in the year I did do music, they asked each pupil to bring a song in, and in the course of a whole year, I think I had 2 choices, and I bought in The Name of the Game by ABBA, which is still my favourite ABBA song. And ABBA wasn't going through their revival at that stage. So the music teacher, who now, I think, looking back, should have been ashamed of himself, because now they go on about ABBA being one of the most complex, it's so difficult to replicate what ABBA songs because there's so many layers to them, so he should have been a bit more excited that I picked ABBA, really, but he wasn't. But when it came to the Beatles, I brought a song off Abbey Road from '69 called Maxwell's Silver Hammer, and that's quite a quirky song about a serial killer with this. I'm not sure if it's the person or the hammer that's this. But anyway, there's death anyway, which I was very excited about. And I guess the music teacher probably would have been the age that the Beatles were. He would have been probably a teenager at the time, and his eyes lit up when I brought it, because also Maxwell Silver Hammer isn't a single; it's a more obscure album track. So that obviously kind of showed to him that I knew a bit more than bringing Name of the Game, perhaps. And he was so enthusiastic that the following week he bought the words and music of Maxwell's Silver Hammer and got the whole class to learn it and sing it. So I did feel...
Because it was 50 years last year that Abbey Road came out. Only last year did I discover it was... I thought it was a lot earlier. I didn't realise it was actually within my lifetime. I knew the famous album cover and Here Comes the Sun and everything. I didn't realise I was actually existing at the time. It
is actually it's actually their last recorded album, but it's not their last released album. They released Let It Be last, but that was recorded before it. I got 2 or 3 more groups, but then I've also got non-music related firsts. And last if we have last. We don't have to do last if we haven't got anything. I think in this case firsts are more interesting. What about the Carpenters? What do you remember of the
Carpenters? Again, they were always there. There is indication that both my mum and my sister likes them. Every time I put a post about Karen Carpenter, kind of like share something, Jen's always enthusiastic. I know Mum liked them. The first Carpenters record, again, I kind of things like Yesterday Once More, Goodbye to Love and everything. I swear I can remember them from first time round, preschool. I would have been too young to remember Close to You. Certainly, Goodbye to Love, I think, probably, and We've Only Just Begun. I think, they were always around, and most distinctly, I think, Top of the World. They are all beautiful songs, and the masterful hand of Paul Williams in help, sort of putting them together. Is there too, and I think he's genius. And then the Carpenters were genius as well, and but yeah, I think that definitely that was the last Carpenters memory. What was Top of the World? Again, Keith's show. Yes, he played Top of the World last Monday on the show. So, but I've got a Carpenter's Gold CD, and they're evergreen. The only off the top of my head, they're just two kind of calling Occupant of Planetary Craft. Sounds like they're trying to cash in on Star Wars and Close Encounters, and the result is a bit trite. I have to say, I'm not keen on that one, which is a shame because I hate saying anything negative about the Carpenters. And their version of Solitaire, I think, just kind of, it's a little bit too drawn out, and maybe Ticket to Ride. I think but there's plenty of absolute gold too, around that to what was the other thing? Oh yes, my one contention with the gold CD is No Sweet Sweet Smile, which is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful song, and I remember it on opening up our show in 1978, where Susan Tully was a presenter, and I remember being entranced by it, and it's still one of my favourite Carpenter songs. It's not on the best of.
Yeah, I think that got played. I think that got played quite a lot over here. Sort of familiar with that as well. I would say I first discovered the Carpenters when I was going through my parents' record collection and playing stuff that I thought would be interesting. And by no means did they have, like, necessarily, even though I've got quite broad music taste, there wasn't loads of stuff in that in their record collection that I was excited by. But I can't remember if it's the album that had Rainy Day and Mondays on. I'm not sure if that's the first or second album, but it's an early one, and I think that's got Solitaire on, and I certainly sort of having decided I liked that, I never bought like every single Carpenters album, but I bought 2 or 3, and greatest hits, and certainly had a phase where I was exploring them, but I just didn't quite go as far as I had with, say, ABBA or the Beatles or other groups. If I'm ever asked, I always say that ABBA and the Beatles sort of got me into music. The Beatles got me into the more rocky side, and ABBA got me into the poppy side, although there were far more rocky ABBA songs than a lot of people realise.
Yes, rock me, you can do me.
There is a period around that sort of time where you could tell they're not quite sure which route they're going to go down. The album I was listening to today has a song called Watch Out, which is almost like a heavy metal song. And I used to hate that song when I first got into ABBA because it was so different from the more tuneful songs. Now it's one of my favourite ones because it feels like being at a rock and roll concert, and you've got the girls are mainly there as backing singers, but it gives you a totally different picture. So I love the fact that it's not typical. When I tend to go back to ABBA, I often go back to the things that aren't typical of them, or the songs that aren't so well known, just because I like to explore that area. But with the Carpenters, they were one of the bands that I explored on my parents' vinyl collection. Goodness knows, somewhere in the 80s. But now I wanted to ask you, when did you first learn about David Bowie?
I obliquely, really. I mean, I've the first David Bowie. Well, actually, I suppose we're talking about 1972. I think because my sister had a one of the, with these Top of the Pops knockoff things where you've got the cover versions that they used to do with a sexy woman on the front. She had one from 1972 with Seaside Shuffle and Starman. Starman. Well, Seaside Shuffle was on it, so obviously that's not a Bowie record, but still with Starman on it. So I was familiar with Starman, so I probably, because 72 is probably one of my earliest memories of Top of the Pops anyway, and I probably saw him at some stage. I couldn't swear to this, but I was familiar with the song. Laughing Gnome was actually probably the other one I remember from that time, because we ha 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 he I'm a laughing gnome and you can't catch me, which is supposed to be his kind of but I remember I was friendly with Kim Horner at the time, and Jen rewrote it sort of would have been late 73. Ha 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 he I love Kim and Kim loves me. So it's more the song, the sort of offshoot of the song, or the sort of influence of the song that I remember rather than Bowie himself. I don't particularly remember Bowie on.
So I don't know if you know about, but the Laughing Gnome is a weird one because it was a song recorded in the 60s before he had any success. And I believe it was re-released in the 70s once that record, whoever it was, whatever record company he'd been on when he'd done that. Yeah. Because he had all sorts of different attempts at being famous in the same way as Mark Bolan did in bands that didn't work out.
Yeah.
And so the Laughing Gnome is really out of place being a hit in the 70s because it wasn't recorded in the 70s, wasn't part of his image. I'm sure he wasn't that happy about it being out. But I don't know if he ever publicised it once it came out. But not in that period. I'm not sure. But
no, I mean it's a fun song, and I think everybody needs a laughing gnome. I think everybody needs a bit of frivolity.
I think you'd be displeased by. I have a feeling that it probably isn't on his greatest hits because it's probably not one he wanted to be a hit, or not by the time he became famous. Yeah. But I can't remember if it is or not. I'm sure it is on some collection. I guess I must have known about David Bowie, but I wasn't that interested in him because by the time it takes a while to, especially on a schoolboy's pocket money. By which I mean me. It doesn't mean to say I had a schoolboy locked in the cupboard and was nicking his book. But yeah, I think I was busy following the bands I was following, and it was not until the mid-90s that I started buying. There was the odd song I'd hear on the radio. There was a while when I lived in Birmingham, when I was working in Birmingham for 6 months, when I used to listen to Chris Evans in the morning when he first started being on the Radio 1 show. And he would sometimes play older songs, and he played Suffragette City. And I'd not heard that. So I found the greatest hits at that point. And then I heard another song called Andy Warhol, which was on his album Hunky Dory. So I bought Hunky Dory. Then I met Callum, and he liked some Bowie, and we used to do music tapes for each other, and so it was a slow. If anything, I think Callum was more into the Covent albums in the 90s. He didn't have and greatest hits and stuff, but he didn't have the 70s albums. Yeah. Whereas instinctivly, I went back and I explored more of the 70s albums, and I'm ashamed to admit this, but about 10 years ago, we spent Christmas at Gareth and Sarah's house, and I'm sure it was that time we did some karaoke, and one of the things was Life on Mars, and I think I did it, or no, somebody did it, and I don't know this at all. And I've heard it several times, and I really like it. But I don't remember a Life on Mars in the 70s at all. I think if we're talking about, I guess I probably, if I was asked in the 80s or even the early 90s what my favourite David Bowie song was, I feel like I might have said Ashes to Ashes, because I might have been aware of that being, because I would have been 7 or 8, or maybe I would have heard it on the radio at the time.
I'm not massively knowledgeable about Bowie, but I've always been fascinated that the Major Tom they talk about in Ashes to Ashes, is he supposed to be the same Major Tom that drifted off hopelessly into space in 10 years earlier in Space Oddity?
Yes.
How did they get him back? Did he come back to Earth only on drugs? Or
well, I can't remember, but there was a third song, Hello Space Boy, which was a duet between him and the Pet Shop Boys in the 90s. So
yeah, I'm more of an admirer of Bowie than a fan. That's not because I don't particularly gel with his music. It's because I don't know much about him. I've never had time. He's never kind of. I've never seen him up close to study him. I do. There's a lot of his songs I like. There's a few that I think that leave me a bit cold, like Absolute Beginners. But I know he's an interesting guy. I didn't realise. Obviously, one of my, although it's maybe not my last memory, but I'm going to call it my last memory is, of course, when he died. He was one of the first people to die in the very bloodthirsty 2016, which also claimed my father. And I remember talking. We were in the office at work talking, and Michelle, who was got a no nonsense kind of girl, we were talking. She was saying that she preferred, from a female point of view, she preferred the later Bowie because he was more masculine. She found the Ziggy Bowie a bit too feminine. And also, I discovered that Kath, who had been my girlfriend in the 90s, was a huge fan. I didn't realise how big a Bowie fan she was, and she almost called. I think her nickname for her son is Ziggy, because I think he was born around the time Bowie died. But I had no idea that she was so big on Bowie.
I wouldn't say I was like the number one fan. I definitely went back and listened to a lot of the 70s. There were one or two of the 70s albums that I hadn't gotten into when I was buying them in the 90s, and I came back to them and did get into them when he died. So
but he's like Cliff and he was a pop survivor. He was, I remember he was doing songs. Well, he was working right until he died, didn't he? I mean, he was.
He did have a heart attack in the ill health in the noughties, so there was a gap. But then he still managed to do 2 albums quite close together before he died.
And also, I mean, I remember being around at your parents' house, and we were late '99, and he was on Top of the Pops.
He was, he was doing stuff and doing Glastonbury and doing all sorts of things until the mid-ish noughties when he was ill. But in fact, I'm sure I've told this before, I was taken to see David Gilmour from Pink Floyd at the Royal Albert Hall, and I'm not particularly a big fan of even. I have grown to like some of Pink Floyd's songs. David Gilmour as a solo artist, I didn't really know much. But I went, and it was the Royal Albert Hall, so that was an experience. And then on the encore, David Gilmour said, "Welcome onto the stage, David Bowie." And so suddenly I was like, "Oh, okay, I am glad I'm here." And they did, because David Bowie did a cover of some early Pink Floyd songs, and he did 2 songs and he left. And it was only later that I discovered that I think after he had his heart attack, he maybe did 2 or 3. It's so few live performances he did after his heart attack that that show I went to is, if you went on Wikipedia or whatever, it would say these are the 3 shows, and I was at one of those just completely coincidentally. So
that really is quite something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
So one more band before we go, and I wonder whether they're a particular band I really like, but they're an 80s band. But I thought because it was sort of your school era, you might remember first hearing them. What do you remember of Duran Duran when they started?
Duran Duran.
What was the thing when you were at school? What was it? What?
Well, it was Duran Duran. I think
Yeah.
I knew them more as a name rather than the music. I was slow. There was certain music I got. I was taping off in 83. I think I started going back to taping off the radio. But I suppose it must have been Girls on Film. But I think Hungry Like the Wolf is probably sticks in my mind a little bit more.
Because I can remember that one of the things I can remember from primary school is the sort of Madness, sort of the rivalry between Madness and the different sort of musical things. But and I know with Duran Duran, it would have been Duran Duran versus Spandau Ballet, and
they were much of a muchness, really, weren't they? Yeah, I suppose they were kind of one of those bands that were in the background. I didn't really. The Union of the Stake was the first one I sat up and took notice of. All the others, I was listening to the chart.
But were the girls in your class like
girls? Girls in my class?
Did you not have?
If only I wish.
Okay.
I went to Highbury, mate. The girls you were caned if you so much and looked at them.
I don't think I even realised that Highbury was a boys' school.
Yeah, it wasn't very healthy. In terms of, I'm not talking sexually. I mean, interrelations with women, i.e., what they're like and everything, because they change so much between 11 and 16. And you're taken away from that. You kind of completely connect. No, I think I got no indication whatsoever.
If you had been in a mixed school, you might have.
I'd love to have. Yeah,
I bet you would.
But no, I have absolutely no. I think the only time I glimpsed, and it was because it was only sort of. A few months a year, as when I was working on Roger Gannon's pantomime. So of course you're around teenage girls that perhaps were about your age or slightly older. And I think what was interesting is there was a disco bit in, I think it was Babes in the Wood or maybe Aladdin, 82, 83. And there was a disco bit where they obviously, Roger wouldn't have known these songs, so they got in Club Tropicana, they had Desdemona, so there was a bit of Wham, and there was very much the tunes of the time. And that was the only remote indication I had of the kind of musical tastes of the opposites. So yeah, I've that was something deprived. I was deprived of, I'm afraid.
I wasn't really interested in Duran Duran until late 80s. And I'll tell you the quick two things. But what I do remember, my earliest memory of Duran Duran is my friend Andrew, who used to live in the village. I remember going round to his house and he was singing to Wild Boys, and he was quite out of tune. And I still remember that 40 years later.
Duran Duran, a bit of a mixed bag for me. Girls on Film I like, Voodoo Kill I like, Notorious I like, Something You Should Know and The Reflex just gets on my tits. It's that whiny voice of Simon Le Bon.
I don't find that, but then there were other people I do. I know it's like I remember talking to our friend Evelyn. I can't remember which band she was talking about now, but I don't want to misquote her.
Chiefs.
No, but it was a band where she sort of said, "I just don't get so and so because I just can't understand their voice." And if that's the way, if you don't get the voice, then it can really. I don't think my dad really likes modern pop singers. Well, not. I don't mean modern as in now. I mean in 80s or whatever. I mean, I think he's still of the generation where when you're singing like that. Like you're in an opera or something. Not casual. Whereas he plays an opera, and I'll be like, yes, so it's just a man going, "Whoa!" I don't get it at all. Sorry. So individual taste, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, with Le Bon, it's sometimes it works. I mean, his voice is always present there, and something like Girls on Film, which has a lovely pulse to it, or Notorious, which jogs along quite nicely, or View to a Kill. But it's suddenly when he turns corners around and doing.
That might be a bad earphone. You might better have a bad pair of earphones. I'll blame it on you.
No. I've heard it many times. No, I just Reflex and Something You Should Know. No, I'm not great favourites of mine. No, Duran Duran. They're all right. Ironically, this is throwing it in. Of course, Wham were very much of that same time. And I actually, the songs of Wham, I found, ironically, a little bit too alpha male and kind of aggressive for my taste.
I think for me with Duran Duran, what I like, I suppose it's the same part of me that loves. I love Kylie Minogue and I love, only Madonna I like, but I like Kylie better. But I like the fact that you can. I could sit there listening to her music, looking at a coffee table book of all of the different looks that Kylie's had over the years, or Madonna. And I like the fashion side of, and I like the fashion side of Duran Duran, and how 80s they are. And the different looks and different hairstyles. I love watching the videos.
Yeah,
that they change.
Oh, I mean that's different. Yeah, I mean that's visually they're interesting. I have to say, going off a bit slightly, I have to say the first time I heard of Wham was a sticker that fell out of a breakfast cereal packet.
Oh yeah.
In the 80s, and I suppose I must have heard them without knowing who they were. Yeah. And there was Ridgely and Michael in the on this sticker. And okay, Wham, right? Well, I wonder what Wham is. And I took it into school. I said, has anyone heard of Wham? I gave the sticker away to somebody who'd heard of them and presumably liked them. But I haven't the remotest idea who they were, what they were, and of course later on I got to know the tunes and I if anything I probably prefer Wham to. No, actually, I do prefer Wham to Duran Duran. Careless Whisper, I adore, and Edge of Heaven brings back a lot of happy memories.
I won't go into the full anecdotes, but I'm pretty sure I've told them by now. But the two moments for Duran Duran for me were kind of almost after their peak. One was in about '89 when I was on holiday and I just bought a tape of their decade greatest hits, and I think that was probably the nearest. Maybe I was going for it. Like, I don't think I was a sort of teenager who had like years of being a teenager and sulking. I think I just had a holiday where I was sulking and I just constantly listening.
Oh, your sulking was concentrated into that holiday.
Just that week, I think I did. I took loads of Target novelizations with me and just constantly read Doctor Who and listened to Decade by Duran Duran. And then
that sounds absolutely blissful.
Then I was in when I was at university and things were a bit much in the first year. One of their albums came out, which had Ordinary World in, and that sort of became not exactly my breakup album, but it became more likely the rubber life-saving ring that kept me from being depressed listening to that album. So I think I'm grateful. I was particularly grateful twice to them, and my loyalty has remained. I still buy all the time they release an album, I buy a new album. And they went through a stage in the late 90s where I don't think their albums even got released over here. And when I went to America, I think I probably picked up their most recent album over there. But then they did have a resurgence over here. And have had top 10 hits in the noughties, so that they're much more easy to follow again now. But before we go, I just want to just a couple of other things that aren't music related to do with firsts. I was wondering, do you remember when you first had like a Chinese meal or an Indian meal or just a not British sort of typical food?
I seem to remember. Circa 1976, we went for a Chinese takeaway. Now it was actually quite rare. We didn't really get takeaways in the 70s, but I do remember there was one time when Jen brought in a Chinese meal. By the I suppose the 90s, I was, it was a regular occurrence. but not quite so regular as when I left home. But yeah, I think with Chinese, yes, Chinese meals started dominating my life a bit more in the early noughties. When I left home in 2001, there was the Hong Kong Eater, which is just down. In fact, we're having that's my last memory of Chinese. That hasn't actually happened yet, but it's about a couple of hours away, and we're having a Chinese tonight. So, yeah. So I think there was a time I have it in my head that it was from the Chinese restaurant that is still there in Castle Street. I don't know if that's actually true or whether I'm mixing it up with something else, but I have a feeling that. But I've always liked the idea of Chinese food. Indian is a little more difficult. I can't remember the first. I mean, I relish Indian meals. In fact, I can do it backwards. Last Indian meal was 2 days ago. It was payday for both of us. Ali took me out to the Kathmandu Kitchen, which is our favourite Indian restaurant in Salisbury, and it was sort of like Thursday. She was finished for the week. I was almost finished for the week, and we just felt like a blowout. So we had a meal there. It's a bit of a plug there, Kathmandu Kitchen, Fisherton Street. Eat out to help out, and it was lovely, and we had a nice bottle of wine. First. When was it? Because of course before we went to the pubs. It was throughout our married life. We went for an Indian meal every month. We used to be at the Rajput, which was beautifully ornate when we first started going there. Then the critics started moving in and being terribly leery and saying, "Oh, it's straight out of a 1970s in sitcom," and all those horrible derogatory things like that. And all the beauty and the style of the the actual Indian culture, they took away. They dumbed it right down because of the critics, which I thought was heinous. But first, when did you first
get into the Vesta curries?
Vesta curry. In the early 80s. I think Mum must have just bought them at one point. I just loved them. I remember particularly in the early 80s, Dynasty and chicken curry Vesta on a Saturday night. That was great. That was my treats. And of course, I still eat them to this day because I just love them. I think they're still tasty. People going on about synthetic. Oh, give me one of those and a curry, and a salad any day. But no, first, what was the first one? So I certainly was going out for curries I think slowly getting into them in the 90s. I don't think I went mad for them in the 90s, but maybe it was an after production meal or curry. There was one I went with Evelyn and Martin and Elaine and Keith in 97 when I stayed over with Evelyn and Martin for one of the premieres of Run. That couldn't have been the first one, surely. Do you know, I've been for so many over the years, and yeah, I don't think I had. It was certainly when I got together with Ali that I started regularly going for. But there was a girl, one of Chantel's do's, and she said, "Oh, I'm hungry. You hungry? And that was my first visit to the Rajput. So I'm going to go plum for. I must have had one before then, but yeah, the Rajput in the late 90s was. No, surely we must have gone to something in the 90s together. Surely.
Yeah, I'm sure we must have done. I mean, my parents would have probably got me into both of, particularly Chinese. They really like Chinese. I think occasionally we'd go to a restaurant. So I was probably, I was up for Chinese or Indian even before I went to university.
Yeah.
I lived in Birmingham, which was the city of Balti. So, the trouble is we couldn't always afford to go and have a proper takeout, so we didn't like to just have fish and chips. But.
Yeah, on the times when I would go out for a meal with my parents, which wasn't very often, it wouldn't have been a curry because my dad didn't like spicy food at all. My mum did. She was a great fan of curry, but Dad, hated the smell and hated this and hated that. So I don't. Yeah, he wasn't a big fan of curry, but that's probably why I was quite late. But I think probably curry wise in the late 70s, early 80s with the Vestas, long before I actually. And it was really only in the late 70s that I started. And certainly it became it was pegged in as a regular thing when I got together with Ali.
We had one last night, but it was a supermarket one from Waitrose, which I picked up when I was coming back from the doctors.
But curries are over the years rapidly become a firm favourite of mine. Well, I really do love them, and I always make sure I get one in once a week. I was going to have one this evening, but then because we had one on Thursday, I'm going to go for Chinese instead.
No, I've got one or two more. I want to keep a couple for the after the title section, so I just need to work out which ones are better for quick answers and which ones are better for long. Okay, let's try this one. Do you remember? We won't do it. Well, we could do it, I suppose, if you have any memories. Do you have any memories of like your first day at school? It could be any school. It could be.
Of course, it would have been September '73. I don't think I had any preconceived ideas about school to start with. I got a memory just before school and just after. Maybe a few weeks in. I remember going past St Martin's Infant School. Mum was saying we've got to be quiet because they're doing prayers, which basically was the assembly we always had on a Friday afternoon, which was called prayers, but in actual fact there was usually a guest speaker. And but yeah, I mean, I remember saying and realising that that was going to be me in a year or so. And also my first memory of school, apart from the smell of the disinfectant and the old building, was getting stuck in my anorak, the zip going on my coat. It might have even been a parka, and being very embarrassed that I couldn't get out of my bloody coat. And that sort of set the tone really for my relationship with school. But I have a multitude of memories of St Martin's Infant School, which I was there from '73 to '76, and in fact I brought it up on Facebook recently because our headmistress has just died from that time, and she was although she was a remarkable person and quite a flamboyant, charismatic teacher, she was also a bit of a bully. And we all had a few stories about that. But yeah, I think those are my two earliest memories, and vaguely and the talking and the people that from there. But yeah, getting my zip stuck with the anorak. Yeah, that was.
I don't remember that much. I do remember starting at a primary school and telling the teacher that I had been scared of the headmistress of my last school, and ironically that was Lester Bryn, who later became a big friend. But I think she probably was a bit scary.
She was. I mean, she was quite a severe looking woman, and she had that nervous tick with the head. So yes, she was quite.
The weird thing about leaving. Well, when I went to the grammar school, when I went to Chaffing Grove for 2 years, I think I would have been scared how different that was to my quiet little 60 pupils primary school. And when I went to the grammar school, I did know a couple of people. I was yet to know Harry and Robin, although they were in my class, but my friend Mark, that I'd known from Montessori, from that early school, was there. So I wasn't, and also I recognised a couple of people from my primary school who had passed 11 plus and gone there. So it wasn't as scary, and anything was better than Chaffin. I just hated that private school for 2 years. I just hated it, and I had to. I mean, it taught me how to learn to survive to a certain extent. But but the 5 years I had that grammar school, which was just nothing was as stressful as that 2 years at that private school. But
I mean, although I quite like the memories I have of St Martin's Infants, and there were nice times and plenty of play times and lots of inventive times and friends, which I still have to this day. I have to say that the only school I actually eventually bonded with and regretted leaving was Harnham Juniors. Although I had trouble initially fitting in, because if you're a new boy, they let you're a new boy. There wasn't any bullying, but I felt that I was eventually able to do my own thing, and even though I gravitated more towards younger kids because they were more interested in playing Doctor Who, or sort of, they were a lot more inventive than the football playing contemporaries that I had. And but Highbury was probably the biggest culture shock of my life. I can't think of anything else that was quite as suddenly you had homework, suddenly you had this, suddenly you had that, completely different structure. And I chickened out of the first day. How about that? It's one of my great cowardly concessions. And I had a stomach pain, which was quite clearly just nerves. And, I played it up, and parents were pretty disgusted. And I can't believe the things I pulled off. I mean, they were showing the new Avengers episode Target that night. And of course, having just pulled a sickie, there was me kind of, can I possibly, I know I'm ill, but can I possibly stay out for the new Avengers? And I go, the sheer bloody nerve of the boy. And I went the first day at school, bewildering, because all the sort of helpful bits with the head of year saying, hello, I'm Mr. Evans, this is the school, here's this, here's that, all the useful stuff, I completely passed me by. I didn't know where to stand for the bus. I had to walk home in the end because, I just, where the hell do you stop for the bus? And it was a disaster, and I skipped the second day as well. I sort of was ill for the second day. I think by then my parents were heartily sick of me. And so I had a very ignominious start to Highbury. And my last day, it was in June '85, and it was one and only time I went to the headmaster's office on his gov. And I finished. I was in the geography room with our PE teacher, and I finished my last exam, which I think was a critique of Lord of the Flies. And I sort of, what do I do now, sir? Just take that report to Mr. Riley's office and get it signed. I thought, right. 5 minutes later, I put my head round the door again and said, where exactly is Mr. Riley's office? Because I kind of, in assembly, a first year had always been pointed out, and to get the headmaster. Headmaster appears. You never saw the first year come back. So I just assumed. I just sort of went into the headmaster's study thinking that there was going to be this pile of bones of the people he'd eaten over the years. Well, not really, but I kind of thought it would be quite fun. And, you never saw them come back. So, and I remember saying, because my first boss was Martin, the newsagents, was Mr. Riley, Mr. Derek Riley, a much more droll man than an amusing man than our Mr. Riley, Miss Bill Riley. And I said, well, I'm just about to work with a Mr. Riley. And I just remember walking home, for some reason doing a Jimmy Savile impression, which would be completely unacceptable now. But and I did just on top of the world that I finally shot of school, which I was thoroughly bored with in the last few years. I think, and I was delighted. I still remember that sense of elation.
I think my later years, I have got a couple from my primary school, which I'll come back to in a sec. I think my later years, because it ends up fizzling out a bit because you go to exams and not everybody's.
It does.
I do sort of remember going back and getting exam results. But what I was going to say is that I was very lucky that I was never, when you start at a school, you're the youngest.
Yeah.
The only time I ever had that was when I started at the primary school. Because when I went to Chaffin, that school went from, 8 to 13. So I came in as a fifth year, so I was already quite senior, and then I went. Then the next, second year, even though I hated that school, I was in the fifth year, and then I was in the sixth year and got to be prefect. So I was never the junior person. And then because I did 13 plus and went to the grammar school, I didn't come in at the ground level on that either. I came in as a third year, so there were 2 years below me. So I was very lucky.
One thing that always made me howl about my final report was my last tutor group with Mr. Vey, my tutor. They said, he said, "Well, write down everything you've done in the last year, in the last 5 years." And I thought, okay, so I put in stuff like the electronics club, which nobody would have remembered, and because I was part of that, but I was really keen on it. I don't remember doing much scintillating electronics work, but I was interested in electronics back then. And that was the first year, the school library. I've been in the school library 5 years, and everything I put in, word for word, appeared on my report. Now, I thought to myself, nobody's checked this, have they? I could have said I was the President of the United States of America in disguise, and they would have put it in. I could have actually told them any old rubbish, because nobody would have remembered. And I was just completely tickled by that. And but I'm glad what I put was actually put it on there. But I did think they'd check it.
What I do remember from my leaving primary school, it's the funny thing is, because our years were so small, literally first and second years would have been in the same class, the third and fourth years would have been in the same class, because there was only 60 people in the whole school, which is why I became friends with Paul Hillier, because he, even though he was a year below me, he was in my class, even though that wouldn't usually happen. So I actually remember when I was in the third year, I knew the people in the fourth year really well and had gone through the school with them. So I remember being more sad when they left the year before I left than I was when I left. I don't know what quite happened, but I do know what happened. I had a really good last week of primary school in a way, because we went to the Brecon Beacons on some sort of outward bound thing, and that really sort of really lovely views and lots of walking, and it was one of the first times I was away from home. I remember the headmistress being a bit horrible because people were trying to call their mums to sort of go, because they felt a bit homesick, even though they were enjoying themselves. And
what is it about headmistresses in those days? They really were awful, weren't they? We got told. She. I remember I was on the phone when she caught. I don't think we'd been told we couldn't. It's just perhaps it became. She started to think it was a problem, and I was on the phone to my mum when she came up to the queue and said, "No, go away." So I was on the phone talking to my mum. I just got my call in before I was the last one who got to call. So that side of it was not so good. But so I think we were away Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Came back on Thursday. Then the Friday was the last day of my primary school. So went very, very quickly, hence I remember very little about it. But yeah, those are the things I remember most about ends of schools. But I as I say, the bottom line is I wasn't a fan of school. I always say I learnt much more dating in Bristol than I ever did in school. Yeah, I think they were very badly equipped to prepare you for life outside of the fact that they kept you away from the opposite sex. Even if sexually you might prefer other people, they are part of real life. And I came out of Highbury not knowing how to talk to them. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. I think I preferred it because it meant that subject didn't come up, and I didn't have to discuss it or be challenged about it. But I guess there was a girls' grammar school, and I think any boys that I guess particularly boys who maybe had sisters who had friends. There probably were people in the school who knew girls that went to South Wilts.
Oh yeah, I mean, the more hip and with it,
Sporty ones.
lads that the alpha male type, they knew girls in the biblical sense as well in some cases.
What's the girls' school comparison to Highbury?
St Edmunds. Jen went there.
Is that in the same part of town or a different part of town?
Oh, it's that was the worst thing about it. It was bang next door.
Yeah,
in fact, some of the buildings were owned by both schools. So you were walking, and all you ever got from the St Eddie's girls was, "My friend fancies you." No, I don't. And that was all the dialogue you had with girls for 5 years. I mean, it's disastrous.
Because South Wilts is almost the other side of town from Bishop.
Oh, it was. And the trouble is, all the girls that I previously fancied went to bloody South Wilts, which was miles away.
I don't know, I might be wrong, but it always seems like there's Salisbury has a very high number of schools. What with Chaffin and Godolphin and Yortu and Bishops and South Wilts, and there was the Swan School at one point. The
I went to three.
School. Yeah,
I went to three completely different ones.
I know some of them are different age levels, but Westwood St Thomas.
I think since the 70s, St Martin's Juniors Infants have teamed up to be St Martin's Primary School, which is where the junior school was, and the infant school is now a hall for hire.
Well, I think we're running out of time here, and I have got a couple of quick ones for you for after the titles. So maybe we'll better think of something else for another time. But anyway, for now,
it's been most interesting.
Well, it digs up things you've forgotten about, doesn't it? So
it certainly does. Yes, goodness me.
Well, anyway, thanks for being here, and listeners, we'll be back again soon, and Nick will be back soon. And thanks again, Nick, and bye-bye for now.
Thank you.
So I've got a couple of shorter ones. Well, I hope they're shorter. Depends how many things you have to say. I know last time we talked about travelling on airplanes. I was wondering if you had any anecdotes about times when you've either travelled on a boat or a coach or a train, like a long distance example.
Yeah, I mean, coach. I think both boat and coach. I would have to go back to 1981 and Dieppe, which I went to with the school. Now, obviously, we'd spent a year doing French, and this was because I was there before. I went to France twice in the summer of '81 because I'd never been abroad before, and I went because I was knocked unconscious in the school with the school playground, and I was off for a bit. Then I think, I can't remember whether I went to Switzerland and Alsace first, and then Dieppe with the school, or was it Dieppe first and then Alsace with the school? Yeah, yes, it was. We did go to Switzerland and Alsace first. Alsace was, that was. No, I was thinking boat. No. Fast forward to Dieppe, boat. Yes, that was my first trip on a boat. I probably went on a ferry, but it was across the channel, and it was a load of us boys. Some of them were more friendly outside of the classroom than they were elsewhere. There's David Brownlee, who was always a bit snotty with me, was actually quite friendly that day. And we started mega early, and we were all flagging a bit by the end. And I remember going across the channel. I had this kind of Rubik cubes were very big at the time, but I had this kind of number puzzle which I still got, and they all did little. Goes with it, kind of having a little bit of a. To keep us all awake, but that was my first big boat trip, I think.
I don't think I did that much on boats until my dad and I went on a sort of a very refined booze cruise where we went
booze.
where we got on a ferry which travelled overnight, and then we drove around. But this was when I was still doing Sutton Park, and I think clips of it have appeared on the podcast too. And it was December, but it was the most beautiful day. And I remember going to this church and all the light streaming through, the leaving colours all over. All that will be on Sutton Park. But a lot of these are a lot more recent than you would expect, really. I mean, Callum and I did a sleeper train up to some high up part of Scotland, where in the middle of the summer, so it got really light quite early, and I don't think I slept at all. I found it quite claustrophobic because those sleeper trains, the corridors are quite slim, and there's no way that you could pass somebody in it. Not being a fatty, they couldn't. So I used to have so you'd come out of your cabin and you'd look down the corridor and then do a quick run down to the end of the carriage for fear of bumping into another fatty or pretty much anyone, because it didn't allow for much sort of crossover. It was quite claustrophobic. I don't think I'd do that again. When
with the coach now, I suppose again Switzerland. That was probably the first big coach journey. I didn't like coach. I think the Blackpool trips were the last time I went on a coach trip. My leg used to. Oh well, no, actually, trips to Tolpaddle. Yeah, we go on a coach then. My leggies are too long for coaches. I always sort of bunch it up, and it's terribly uncomfortable.
I used to do some of those back when I used to go to nightclubs a bit more. I went through a stage of getting on whatever they used to call the buses, where you only used to pay a few pounds, and I'd go up to Manchester maybe to go out clubbing on a Saturday night, occasionally to a particular club, or meet friends up there. So I did do a few sort of trips on coaches, which were because they were the cheap alternative. But
I've as I say, a boat of the two. I think boats are my preferable, even though I can't swim. But I always enjoyed them much more than, because you can go around and breathe the sea air, and that was much better.
I gotta go now. Bye.
I want to go with you.
Gotta go. Bye.
Goodbye, 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 goodbye.
This show is part of the Pride 48 network. Find more shows over at pride48.com.
Oh dear. What's going on now? Oh, it's the Shy Life podcast.
Let's go.
I have a voice. I have a voice.
You have a voice.
You have a voice. We have a voice.
We have a voice.
Unique voices in podcasting.
UnivazPods.net.
So my other question is, you don't have to answer it, but I think you probably won't mind. Do you remember the name of the first girl that you fancied?
Oh yeah. I'm actually quite surprised I do. Well, actually, having said that, she's my oldest friend. You know of her, Kim Horner. She lived down the road from me in the Beaches in the late. Well, she was born in '69. She's exactly 6 months younger than me, and we were. She was my first best friend, really, and she can be seen on my 4th birthday. Picture. I've got. It's a picture I relish, and I think it sums me up quite well because there is a undisguised lustful expression on my face of sheer joy. She sat on my lap on my 4th birthday in 1972, and she I think was probably. I mean, I according to my mum, I used to flirt with the babies in the next cot when in the Central Health Clinic, which still exists, albeit in a rather emasculated form. Yeah. So I have always had eyes for the light guys. And Kim Horner was certainly the first crush, I think. And for some time, I kind of thought, wouldn't it be nice to get to know her again when I was in my teens? But of course, she was quite a sophisticated lady of music by then. And I shamefully threw away my chance to get chatting with her a bit more on my 18th birthday because I had some friends around. And I spent more time with my more modern friends like Matt and Sharon than I did with the opposite, with the Horners, Nat and Kim. And I would love to be back in touch with them, but I don't think either of them on Facebook. I think obviously they're married with kids, and Kim's gone 50, and Nat would be 50 next year. But I remember Nat being born.
There were a pair of twins at my primary school called Rachel and Catherine. I think I remember liking Rachel. Also, I hung around with my friend Sarah a lot, but I don't really know that was ever proper romantic or anyway. She was a tomboy anyway, so I think I admired the fact that she wanted to be.
Yeah, and to be honest, I have been known to fall for tomboys. There's something about them. I don't know what it is, but I do like. There's something that's always attracted me to tomboys.
There was a girl in our village at one point called Lindsay, and she was quite tomboy as well. I know some of the other girls tried to set it up so that I'd be. And I think Lindsay was behind the bush, listening. And they were trying to get me to say, "Oh, tell us, do you like Lindsay? Then do you like Lindsay?" And then Lindsay popped out of the bush and made me. It was all to make me embarrassed. It was towards the end of the tomboy era. Worked really well until I became the least. Not that I wanted to go out with them, but they didn't know that. But yeah, towards the end of the tomboy era, I became the boy that they all knew, who they couldn't possibly think of as being interested in because they'd grown up with me, sort of thing. So, and also I liked ABBA.
Yes, I mean, yes, I flirted with Kim in the early days, but I think probably maybe by the 80s when I thought, wouldn't it be nice to meet her again? I think probably. We'd intellectually gone our separate ways, and B, I was, like you say, I was the boy she'd grown up with. Similarly, I didn't go to see Helen Russell, who's probably known me the longest. I went. She was. I've never fancied her, but she was her mum was in hospital having her at the same time I was. My mum was in hospital having me, so we've known each other since day dot. But I wouldn't, even though I'd done PE with her in the 70s, I wouldn't go and see her in Calendar Girls at studio because it would have, I like the naked female form like anybody else, but it would have felt like seeing my sister naked. It would have been just wrong.
My first boy crush, it all links in really. My first boy crush was a boy called Andrew, and he was the one who sung Wild Boys out of tune. And my second boy crush was also a boy who lived in the village after Andrew had left, And this boy moved in. I think I just fancied anyone who lived in that house. To be honest, it could have been anything.
I know you're like. Although we operate from opposite sides.
Yeah.
You're a bit like me in that your appreciation of people from a sexual point of view is or from a fancying point of view knows no bounds, and I'm still just as impressionable and tarty as I was when I was a baby.
The boy who moved into the house next was called Damien, and he was the brother of the girl Lindsay, who the girls were trying to get me to admit to fancying.
Yeah.
Oh, what irony!
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I can't remember is my first kiss. I had a peck with Helen Smith, or Helen Gill as she is now, but it wasn't a proper kiss. I don't think I had a full-on snog until I was in relationships. So I was getting on a bit.
To be continued, listeners. Watch this space.
Watch this space, but not too closely.
I hope that Yeti bathed today. That's all I can say.
Boy, I hope Nick Goodman is on this episode.
491.
He's not all that shy, is right. Sheesh.